Welcome, everyone. So I'm Gary Ford. I'm one of the co-founders of Men for Inclusion, alongside Mark and Jill. And I guess Stephen was kind of part of our original group to get this up and running. For those of you that are new, this is a fortnightly kind of discussion, event, ideas generation kind of group. We paused over the month of August because we kind of recognized lots of people tend to go away. So this is our first event back post that holiday pause. And just before that, and I think our last event was on something like the 27th of July, we started in off a sequence of discussions based around the book that Stephen, Jill and I wrote, The Accidental Sexist. I will clearly post a link to that in a few seconds once we get going, just in case there's anyone on here that's unfamiliar with the material. So our intent is to go through each of the chapters of those book and kind of generate some dialogue around it in this session for the next few events. Today's focus is on our second chapter, which is basically around how you go about engaging men, and when you try to do that, what are some of the things that that you encounter, what are some of the things they say, and kind of why do they say it. Last time we focused in on what's the problem. So a lot of the research that we did found that a lot of people felt that there'd been so much progress on gender equality in the workplace, this was no longer an issue, right? There were this problem hadn't been fixed, that we'd been at it for decades, and there was no longer any issues to solve. And I think our book tended to find that was really not true, and it certainly wasn't true from the experience that Stephen and I had when we were doing work in this space at JP Morgan. So last time we talked about making the invisible visible, but today we're going to talk about having done that, how do you start going about getting men engaged in that conversation and recognizing that there's work for them to do too. So a lot of this is about what are some of the things that we found men would say when you started having this conversation with them around gender equality. And I think it's important to say that this is not what all men say. This was just Stephen, Jill and I kind of summing up some of the themes that frequently came out of the conversations we were having with those hundreds of men. I think before we kind of jump into this, I'd also like to just ask Stephen to maybe give a bit more of an introduction about himself and his involvement with this and his work that he's been doing in this particular space for many years.
Hi, so my name's Stephen Koch. Nice to meet you all today. So my background, similar to Gary's, is mostly from IT. I did an IT degree at university. I've been working in IT for over 30 years now. Most of that has been in investment banking, though the last year or so I've been working in healthcare. Gary and I first met at JP Morgan back in 2013. I had just come from another investment bank, and one of the things I felt moving from the previous investment bank to JP Morgan is there were things about how women were treated and perceived that were surprising to me, and it seemed a bit more of a chauvinist environment coming to JP Morgan from the previous investment bank, probably because there were more women in leadership at the previous bank. And so that came as a bit of a shock. And so I started working with the women's networks there, Women in Technology in London, and then more broadly to try and see what I could do to help about that and help explain to men how I thought it could be better from my previous experience, and then from a lot of the research that Gary and I and many others at JP Morgan did. And so we worked together from 2013 since then on developing the male ally network at JP Morgan, and that's how the genesis of the book came out of our experience of doing that. It's probably fair to say that I was, in an accidental sense, a sexist when I started. I wanted to help. didn't really spend a lot of time talking to women about some of the problems. I'd probably just taken it all for granted, but the more I started to dig into it and talk to people and look at the research, the more interested I became in the topic. And so that's how I got more and more engaged, and then worked with Gary on the book. So thank you for inviting me today.
Thanks, Stephen. Actually, it's funny, actually, one of the downsides of calling the book The Accidental Sexist is that pretty much now every time someone asks me about it, they ask me, so are you an accidental sexist? And of course, I have to say, yes, I probably am. And I probably was when I started this journey. And probably you are too, if I'm honest. Brilliant. Okay, so as hopefully people saw from the event plan that we put onto the website and into Eventbrite, roughly the format is I'm going to read a short extract from the book and then sort of pull out some of those common repeatable things that men would say to us. I'm going to pose a few of them to Stephen. So Stephen's going to talk about what our typical response might be for those questions, and then I'll invite anyone from the wider team to give an opinion on that too. Once we've done the first three, we'll let Stephen step out of the spotlight, and we'll just start maybe asking everyone for those opinions on some of the other things that we feel men frequently say when they're first introduced to this subject. So if I jump into the book, so this is kind of obviously a short extract from chapter 2, and it's a section called Our Experience Talking to Men. So we, Stephen, Gary and Jill, and the teams we have worked with have talked to thousands of men about gender equality at work. Here's a summary of what they tend to say. Most agree that gender diversity is an issue, especially in leadership roles. Men often do not recognize that their own biases and behaviors are part of the problem. It is usually other people's biases that are seen as the issue. Men struggle to identify what they can do to make a difference, or are too afraid of making a mistake and doing or saying the wrong thing to help. When men say they are willing to help, they often don't follow through. Men in particular have a low bar for measuring success. They will often highlight, I hired a woman recently, as evidence of progress. There are a number of themes that have come up again and again. Below are some of the main points men make, what we think these mean, and typically how we respond. So I'm going to start with the first one, and that's men often say something like, I don't know what I can say anymore. Stephen, what do we tend to say if men say that?
Can I just add one thing before I answer that question? So what I would say about this whole area in particular is I personally found it quite challenging when we started. I think what we've tried to do here is distill our experience from doing this a lot. I personally found it quite hard at some of the sessions we ran, particularly early on, when people were posing these questions. And so I do think it's okay to feel challenged about it. Having these types of discussions, I think, where you get out in front of some of those problems and say have a bit of time to explore how you might answer, I think really helps in kind of giving confidence and be able to engage men on that topic. So I think in terms of the question, I don't know what to say anymore. I think there's two flavours of that question, or two reasons why people ask that. There is one aspect of it, which is what they're like people think political correctness gone mad. They're feeling kind of victimised or overlooked, or pretty negative about the topic in general because of something they think has happened. And I think that can be quite a challenging opinion to overcome. I think what we help them do, and we found has been most successful, is trying to help them understand that when people think it's political correctness gone mad, they're often interpreting a comment as they would hear it and saying, well, it'd be fine. Like, if that behaviour, I experienced that, it would be fine. It wouldn't be a problem for me. Why are people getting annoyed about it or frustrated? And so I think for them, it's really important to understand. And maybe I used to use an example, for example, that I got into for this, where I used to go to a trading floor, and if I was trying to find one of the risk managers, I would often ask a woman at the end of the desk where so and so sat, because the floor is huge and I'd never know where everyone sits. And it occurred to me, after about 6 months of doing this, that if you're a female trader at the end of the desk and you've got people like me showing up every day who keep asking, where does so-and-so sit, so-and-so sit, like once is fine, right? But if people have that bias and they assume because they're a woman, they're an admin, and they're okay to ask, whereas in reality they're an oil trader or something, all these men doing this, could have quite a negative impact on their performance, how much time they had. So I think it's not just what actually the comment is, it's more around what that person's lived experience is and what effect that comment's having on them. And what you can't assume is how you would react is the same as how someone else would react. And I think if you use examples and paint that, then I think that can be very helpful in changing people's opinion. I think the other thing that people sometimes mean when they say that is, genuinely, I'm not really sure what to use. Can I say lady? Can I say girl? Can I have to say woman? Can I say female? And it's more of a, I'm really not sure of the right language to use. And I think you can obviously talk about particular examples and phrases that work or don't work, but I think the most important thing, I think, is talking to people, taking risks. So sometimes it's very easy, if you're not sure how to talk to someone, to just don't talk to them and don't use those phrases. But I think it's important to actually actively engage, ask people how they like being called. If you're not sure, ask and take a bit of risk. And if you get it wrong, because we all do at various times, fess up to that, apologise, and that's how you learn.
Thanks, Stephen. Has anyone else got any thoughts on this question? I really would like others to offer opinion. If you find somebody saying, like, I just don't know what I can say anymore, I'm confused, have other people deployed particular responses to that they think would be successful?
I wanted to share, I find it quite interesting actually, because at work I found it where people who are on the other side, so for example, either women or LGBT colleagues, want to educate others when people say, I don't know what to say anymore, basically. Whereas sometimes they can also almost attack people, and therefore people feel scared, and that's why they come to the response of, I don't know what to say anymore, because they're just simply they feel hostile in that environment when they are making this comment. So I guess what I want to share is that normally to those people, what I really try to do is if they're LGBT, if they're women, is give them that one chance. Stephen, you said you would always go to the woman sat at the end of the desk and ask her, you say that one time is fine. If it's going to be every day, obviously it's probably going to be annoying, and then that's when the bias comes in. But I think we all have a responsibility, as well as to obviously say, I don't know what I can say anymore, but also to give everyone a chance to educate them that first time. And if it obviously keeps happening, then that's when you almost have a ground to be annoyed. But I think as we progress, because I think at work I've experienced that a lot of the time trying to gauge people on, for example, having their pronouns now, or when you introduce yourself and you say pronouns, and all these different changes that it is a lot of change in slides that has happened quite very fast for people who are used to different things to adapt. So what I normally try to say is just give them a chance the first time and actually educate them, rather than just, I don't know, be defensive from the get-go. If you explain something to someone and you actually do explain the why and how it makes other people feel included, then that's where I see the real benefit.
Great point, Alvaro. It's a really interesting space, and I was part of a diversity workshop probably about a year ago now, where, and I blogged about this. I wrote a blog about it. I witnessed this really interesting interaction between an Indian woman and a disabled white man, where they had this common dilemma about certain phrases which they didn't like or particularly that pertain to them. So the Indian was talking about people using the word BAME in a very indiscriminate way, where she said, well, I'm Indian and I'm brown, and she was very strong around that, specifically how I prefer to be referred to. And the the person, he was at great pains to point out he did not like being called disabled, but he was okay being called person with a disability, because he felt that those were two very distinctly different phrases. And it was very interesting interaction that both of those people, who obviously were coming at this from a good place, were unclear about what terminology to refer to each other. And therefore just having that conversation, and to your point, explicitly saying what are you comfortable with, how should I refer to these things, that's an important, maybe organizations therefore deliberately establish those type of boundaries and agree practices that work for them. Sorry, Kevin, you've come off mute. Did you want to add to that? Or?
Well, I was going to say that I think that when you get a situation where someone is saying, I don't know what to say anymore, it's sort of born out of a frustration. But yeah, I suppose we all have to start realizing that, I mean, the world is changing all the time. And so, yes, there are what used to be acceptable even just a few years ago or a year ago, whatever, is evolving. And I guess the frustration from the people that are saying something like, I don't know what to call it anymore, is that it can take a little bit of work to actually keep up with what people, and there are lots of occasions where I don't know what the acceptable term, and you're just so afraid of offending somebody that you just have to be really, really careful. And yes, you could get frustrated, but I think what it says is that you need to take the little bit of extra time to figure it out, find out what it is. And not everybody has the time to do that. You just need to, and I suppose you have to just be careful about who you're saying this kind of thing to as well.
Yeah, and this thing about maybe, Alvaro saying take a bit of risk and maybe just ask and, say I'm not sure and, can you help me a little bit? Okay,
if you're less familiar with people, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I think my response to it would be quite simple, and I'd just say what you would ordinarily say, or what you plan to say, but just make sure you're aware of the impact, or try and be as aware of the impact as possible, because I think actually you want to shun people into silence, but I think it's one of those things of actually, because that's quite unhelpful, but I think actually they should be aware, or as aware as possible, who's involved in the conversation.
Yeah, good point. Okay, excellent. So thank you for those initial thoughts. Let's try another one, right? So the next one I think on my list, that I'm going to start with Stephen again, is I am not privileged.
Yes. So I think that's something that we heard a fair amount. What I would say about when people say that is, it's not that often they say it, but if they do say it, they tend to have a really strong opinion about it. And often what it comes from is a certain lived experience. When they hear that they have kind of male privilege, they're thinking of silver spoon in the mouth, public school, maybe like education and family and job opportunity benefits that they don't have. And because they don't have that, they will react strongly against being thought of as having some sort of privilege. So I think one thing to do is to try and, when someone says that to me, I try and make it clear we're not talking about backgrounds and those other things. We're really talking about the fact that the working world is mostly shaped by men, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, for men. And so as a result of that, kind of assumptions people make, biases they will have, practices, all these things are setting up to give them a natural advantage, whether they realize it or not. And that's really the type of privilege that we're discussing about. And it's got nothing really to do with background. Sometimes people react better if you just think about it as like an advantage or a male advantage, because I think the word privilege as well has certain connotations that people can react negatively to. But that's how I would tend to answer that question when it comes up.
Thanks, Stephen. Anyone got any thoughts around this? So this sense that you suggest that men have a certain level of privilege that women are not afforded in the workplace, but they react really strongly to that sense that they have privilege. What have other people seen this, and if so, how did they respond?
Gary, can I just say this, Yvonne? Everyone has privilege. Depends in what context. So when we're talking so like, for example, I'll start with the race and then move to the gender. So like, for example, no one would think anything would be surprised. And I think actually there's a book, John Amaichi, who wrote Promises of Giants, and he was a former NBA basketball player. He wrote about a given experience when he was in Covent Garden looking out from his flat, and he saw young white guys tap the shoulder of a policeman, ask for something. Now, everyone looks at that and say, oh, no problem. They didn't think anything of it. But if a young black man was to tap the shoulder of a policeman, especially, and he was tall and big, he would probably elicit a different reaction, right? So there's the privilege that the young white man has without even realizing. It's just because of the social context that we're in. When you talk about male and female in the workplace, you know, there are just certain things that are, because like you say, the workplace has been framed traditionally by men for other men. So there are just certain things that are a given that subconsciously some men would not even think about in the way they interact, which a woman may not know those cues or has to learn those cues. And so that's why we say that, like Stephen said, it's about having an advantage, whether or not you know it, whether or not you're conscious of it.
To completely agree, Yvonne. And I think it's this point about even like the cognitive load. You know, it's very rare that a man in a workplace situation considers his gender. You know, it's sort of part of his thought process. Whereas I think women are far more likely to feel that their gender is something they have to think about in a context because of those. So even from just a cognitive load, there's some additional requirements, if you like. And then, you know, and to your point, once you add other aspects, you know, ethnicity or ability or sexuality, all of those things just add up. That, you know, people just have extra things to deal with. And I really like the phrase relative advantage as opposed to privilege. I think that may be a better way of painting that picture. Are there anyone else kind of any thoughts on this subject of privilege? David?
Hi, yeah, I was just going to say, and you've sort of covered it already, that privilege. I think I agree with the concept. I think I understand the concept. I also sort of see the point around people who associate it with, you know, private school educated, whatever, all of those things that we talked about, the silver spoon in the mouth there. But it's necessary for all of us to understand that, but it's a really, really, really unhelpful word to use. I can't think of a better one. You've just come up with that phrase there. I was literally thinking that this is not a helpful contribution because I don't think the word's helpful, but I haven't got another one. Thanks very much for listening. But it is, I think it, you know, it is literally that. It is very important to realise, but it's such a loaded term. It's such a loaded term, and that's, people are just responding to the term rather than getting down to what it means, and it just sets us back sometimes because you immediately, and I think, I don't know, but I think a lot more, you know, people answer questions around that. You know, it's either, yeah, I've got a problem with it, I'm not privileged, or no, I don't have a problem with it, which is basically, I'm not going to tell you that I do. And then somewhere in the middle, there's somebody like me that goes, God, I don't like that phrase, but I understand it, and yeah, I'm right. I am part of that group. So that's
it's a really well-made point. I think it's a very loaded word, and yeah, I think certainly in the work that we now do, we seek to avoid it. Notwithstanding, we often recommend people to watch a TED talk by Michael Kimmel, which talks a lot about privilege, and clearly there's books that focus very heavily on, you know, certainly, you know, white privilege and stuff like that. So, but I think, yeah, the conversation continues to evolve and move on. And yeah, I'm a bit with you, David. We tend to avoid trying to use it and shift to something like relative advantage or something like that. Susan, did you want to make a point on this?
To some extent, I'm adding to what has already been said. So the word privilege, it evokes all sorts of emotions and pushback. And my tendency is to start very much with where people are. So it's always, because what I believe is irrelevant So recognizing that everyone is on a journey, it's understanding where they are, it's asking questions to gain greater clarity in terms of their thinking, and then possibly making some suggestions based on what their thinking is. And it's almost therefore from their journeying with them to where they need to be.
Yep.
David said, avoiding terminology that doesn't make sense to people. So I'm a white working class boy, and you're telling me I'm privileged when I had to struggle to do this, that, and the other. It doesn't help the conversation. And my focus is on the end result. So start with where you are and journey with you.
Great point. Thank you for sharing that. I just let you know your microphone's a little bit it was a little bit in and out, but I think hopefully everyone got most of that, because it's a really good point.
I think it also depends on who's saying it. So if it's a white male, for example, entering into the conversation, then actually they make themselves slightly vulnerable to say that actually, what's your opinion on the word privilege? And actually I'd say that I do have privilege here, and actually probably get away with it without being seen as I don't know, trying to push too much for your own agenda. Whereas actually I think if it's somebody that perhaps wanted to raise awareness for you, but actually stands to benefit, if that's the right word, then actually I think it's probably more difficult to use the word.
Yeah, good point. Okay, thank you for that. So let's try another one, and I'll put Stephen in the spotlight again. And the third one we're going to explore is this response that we used to get a lot from men, which is, there's a lack of diversity in my particular occupation or field because there's a big pipeline problem for our industry, or no women ever apply for my jobs, and I can't fix this because the issue is that there isn't women out there to hire. Stephen.
Yeah, what I would add as well is I think this is also quite a common one from women. It's something I'm getting from our HR department at the moment when I'm trying to recruit more diverse employees. I have to say I really struggle with it, because it feels like when I hear that someone's just kind of making excuses, and they're setting the bar incredibly low, where they're saying, computer science graduates are 19% women, so kind of that's the maximum I'm going to aim for, and so the fact I'm hiring below that or something is it's a pipeline problem, and it's nothing really I can do about it. So I find that one a little bit frustrating when I do hear it. I mean, I've heard lots of different ways of answering that. One thing that I've heard some of the senior bankers say, the bank who used to work at JP Morgan, they would say, the pipeline is kind of the average. Like, I don't employ you to be average, I employ you to do much better than average, and so you better not be limited by what the pipeline is. So I think there's an aspect of that you don't have to hire the entire market. You just need to, you're hiring, for your team or your department, so you're hiring a relatively small number of people. So the general populace shouldn't necessarily matter to you. So I think there's that aspect of it. And then often what people come back to as well, I don't get that many people applying for my roles, diverse people applying for my roles, which is kind of another way of saying the same thing. And there, I think it's a matter of trying to help them understand all the things that you can do that reduce that pipeline to a much, to a very small amount. I often use examples that I've seen from my work experience. So we were hiring some developers in Glasgow, and we had people who were looking for a developer of a certain amount of tenure, and they had to have Python 3 and they had to have banking experience. And it's very easy, if you actually talk to them about you're hiring such an incredibly, if you're defining how you're hiring your role in an incredibly specific way like that, you might not find a lot of diversity in that. But if you're a bit more creative about how you think about the role, thinking about not necessarily a finished article, cross-training people, things like that, it can change the pipeline dramatically. And this, so was one, how you define the role, what you look for, how you describe the role, where you look. All of these things can have huge impacts to the market you're actually going for. And so I don't think you shouldn't just be thinking of the pipeline coming at university and, you know, that's what I'm aiming for. You need to be a lot more creative about it. And then the other thing that we used to point to, and probably you all had similar experiences, people do not hire at the same rate of diversity across the organisation. You will often find areas doing a much better job than others. And so sometimes it's easy if someone say, well, so I can hire to 20% women, but you can point to other areas that are hiring twice that rate. And so when you're having those conversations, it's really helpful if you can start to pick out where the leaders are in your company and use that as an example of what they've been able to do, and maybe point to some of the things that they've actually, some of the steps they've taken to achieve that. And I think for me as well, if you can get people thinking like that and seeing that there's things they can do to directly influence it and give them lots of ideas about things they can try, I think that hopefully gets them out of that mindset of thinking, well, that's just the pipeline, that's just the market, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Diversify your recruitment strategy, I think, is the summary. Any thoughts on this particular challenge from anyone else?
Yeah, I agree with, I agree with Stephen about the, I'm having problems with computer. I agree with Stephen. Those are just, I just say those are lame excuses. And I've been involved in DI work increased more in the last 2 years in the pandemic, because I've not been able to traveling as much. So I've been able to like get under the skin of that. And when they say we can't find qualified candidates, I guess my question is, many organizations are looking at the criteria and saying, do I really need to have someone who is, you know, has all these qualifications? Am I holding, like, for example, if you're saying, am I holding the women to the same standard as men? When it comes to the pipeline, I would say, where are you recruiting from? So like many organizations in the city have pushed back and said, when someone says, I can't provide a diverse candidate slate, gender diverse or ethnic diverse, I say, well, where are you recruiting from? Because if you only go fishing in the same pond, you're not going to get anything different. You need to go fishing in the sea. So you need to look at the way you write those job descriptions and everything. And also there are organizations out there who can bring you talented people. I mean, we've seen this in the last year working with organizations to bring us more, increase the diversity of our pipeline. And even like when you think about women in tech, it's looking at then which are the organizations out there who are working with the women who are studying, technical subjects, STEM subjects at university, so that they can know about your organization, understand your diversity culture and inclusion culture, and say, that's actually a firm I want to go work with. Then you have a lot of people self-select out of your process because the face the organization puts to the out there isn't the right one. So it's just saying, work a bit harder and be more imaginative.
So it's a great point, Yvonne. I mean, I think I have to flag up clearly the great work that Mark, who obviously isn't here tonight, does with the E2W organization. Katie's here as a representative of that, I guess. So deliberately targeting, kind of helping, or supporting women in the financial services industry to a very specific recruitment strategy. I think the other good example I like to use is companies that have basically just, created their own capability, right? So I don't know if it's still going, but Stephen and I presented a diversity in tech conference probably about 4 years ago now, certainly something of that ilk. And the woman who immediately followed us were on the stage was head of digital strategy at Sky. And at the time, Sky had built their own women in tech coding academy. So they said, well, if we can't find them somewhere in the market, we're going to create them ourselves, right? And they built this whole program with very tough, assessment criteria to get onto the program. But once you're on the program, they would teach women with no technical background how to become software engineers. And they found it superbly perspective. So this idea of just completely switching your approach is saying, well, if the pipeline is not out there, we're going to create the pipeline ourselves, right? I mean, not every company can do that. It obviously requires significant investment, but this idea of being creative and just switching the dial, I kind of really like that as an approach.
Just something to add there, Gary, and it's if you consider it, it's it's the view of the criteria of the candidates that you're looking for, and it's very much it's judgment as relative value, that you're not attaching value to diversity. You've got this whole list of things. You've got this, I need that. Yep. And at the end you go, and I need a diverse candidate list, and it's kind of like, okay, so it's subconsciously you've already put it there. So and I am not a technical person, so the people will scream with laughter, I'm sure, but is that so that Python 3, if I've just mimicked exactly what somebody else just said because I don't know what it is, you're putting that there, so diversity is below that, because really diversity doesn't add as much.
Yeah,
I cannot teach anybody to be diversity. I can teach somebody to do Python. So make your judgment, and it's kind of what somebody else was saying earlier. It's part cop out, part either conscious or subconscious decision around your relative, the value you attach to the criteria that you're looking for in a candidate.
Yeah, really like that point, David. Yeah.
And just to butt in as well, sorry, Gary, as you mentioned, that this is exactly what ECW does. This is, day in and day out what we do. But I think the most important thing that Yvonne mentioned as well is that we don't just work for our candidates, we really work for the clients as well. So we really take time to nurture, is probably not the right word, but really take the time to talk them through the role. As David said, is this necessary? Are you putting this at the bottom as kind of an extra barrier to make it more difficult, or is that teachable? Is that trainable on, during the, when you get started in the role? So really making sure that clients are not closing themselves off and, remaining quite open, because, when you advertise a role, actually what they end up doing in the day-to-day job is often quite far from that. So, writing something on a piece of paper can become such a barrier in its most simple form. So yeah, we do a lot of work with our clients as well to try and help them with this.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I really like that point about, there's a re-education perhaps for all of us when we come to think about hiring. Yeah, Seb, do you want to add something here as well?
Yeah, so I think the pipeline is the here and now. So if you're looking for a role and you can't flex on what that role is, then I think actually you can only fish from what's available. You can only take on what's available. But I think actually, if you're trying to look at wider systemic change, and actually, so from my perspective, I could, or hopefully, touch wood, health dependent, obviously, I could have 40 years left of my career, so I could be looking to wind down slightly by 2061. Which is actually, the bits that I can do is use my privilege to try and actually understand what some of the problems and barriers are, and then actually use a lot of my enthusiasm to put that information in front of the right people, which can actually mean that then you can, a bit like the Sky Academy you were talking about earlier, you can then start to actually grow your own programs. But even if you look at the industry, so take for example the 10,000 Black Interns program. So I think actually that's the industry recognizing that we've got a bit of a responsibility to try and undo some of this systemic prejudice that's there, but also to give people from different backgrounds some role models to look up to, because not only does that benefit that individual candidate, that also benefits wider society. So I think actually it kind of depends on how wide your scope is, but also kind of how much you've really thought about what you're trying to fill. Because if you have somebody else that looks very visibly like another candidate, then actually or like every other candidate, then actually you don't benefit from the cognitive difference, but also there's potentially limited benefit in terms of actually people being able to see people like them within the organisation.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, and really good points as well. So I'm going to kind of tackle the last two in a more open forum, and so Alex, Hannah, Matthew, Bethan, I don't think you've had an opportunity to jump in yet, so feel free to join if you're comfortable doing so. But the next one I'm going to pose to everyone, so anyone's can happily jump in on this one, was this thought that diversity has gone too far, men are now the disadvantaged group. As a middle-aged white male, it's impossible for me to now be promoted or for me to be successful. There's no job left for me. What do people think you should say when someone kind of raises that as an issue?
I just wanted to add, I think the diversity has gone too far. It's really interesting because I think it's one of those things where everyone always I don't know, somehow I feel like more likely at some point in your life you will fit into some form of exclusivity where you need to be part of the D&I group, I guess. I'm a man, but I also have a hidden disability, and in the workplace, people don't see those things. So obviously, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, there's always those elements that you don't know about people. So I guess back to the first thing I shared is about always being able to be in the position where you can educate others. And actually, if someone says something about disability without knowing that I have a disability, then I can tell them, oh, by the way, I actually fit into that, fit into a group. I have a disability, therefore, just I think it's about making people aware, but also as a self, taking that responsibility to help others feel comfortable when saying stuff. So I think it's not about diversity has gone too far. I think it's that people feel more comfortable sharing, who they are, how they identify, how they like to be addressed, etc. So when men, even I do have friends say, "Oh, men are this disadvantaged group now," but I'm like, well, I'm a man, and obviously I don't feel disadvantaged because at the end of the day, I think perhaps depending on all the things, you somehow fit into that at some point where you want to be, well, you feel excluded and you want to feel included.
Great point.
Steve,
Alex or someone else? Sorry.
Isn't this where you say enter the male allies group? Because I think actually, if you just look at most organisations, men still hold the dominant position. So therefore, actually, so that you're not disadvantaged, and so that positive discrimination doesn't come into recruitment practices, or so that actually, you kind of got to educate yourself on the issues that actually would prevent other people from being able to progress their career. I'd say so.
Yeah, great point. Beth, and sorry, you flashed up at me there for a second. Did you want to join in on this point?
Yeah, can you see me? I've got a blank video, sorry.
We could see you momentarily, but you've gone again. Oh, no, you're back. Brilliant.
I'm back. I can't see myself, so that's fine. Yeah, thank you. Just to say, it's been brilliant. I joined a bit late, sorry, I was traveling. But this question is so key. So Hannah and I work together with working on gender equality in our organisation. And, this is such a key question for us, how to engage men and to challenge that feeling of being threatened, that actually, it is that privilege piece. We're threatening privilege effectively, but how to soften the language. I really liked what guys have said about perhaps using relative advantage instead. And it's how to, I guess, get the conversation going. So in the same way that I have white privilege and I try and be really aware of that, and actually, am a really active ally, to any other groups of people in our organisation, by understanding the challenges that, although I might not experience them myself, I can meet people where they are and know how they are and what barriers they are. So but how do we get more men to take that approach and not just see it as protect my position and stay and kind of not drop the ladder for other people.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a fear thing there that you that maybe needs addressing. I also think what Stephen and I found at JP Morgan was when people were saying that, often they did have some sort of evidence for it. They had seen some particular example of some very poor management practice where someone had deliberately hired someone just because of their, just because of their gender, or so I think in general, I think the approach would be, it's back to the fact that you've got to come at men with this idea that this is not about making them feel guilty. This is not about the fact that you've identified that they need remedial training. It's about the fact that we are all accidental sexists because we all have the deep cultural conditioning around gender stereotypes, and they're important. Their view is important too. So if they feel that, you know, they're now the group that's disadvantaged, then you have a conversation with them that explores that and say, so why do you think that? What are the examples you've seen? You know, where are you seeing this as an issue? And there could be something we have to address as an organization because there are, you know, other bad things happening. The chances are that it's not true. So typically, you know, certainly when we're at JP, we could look at the data that says, if you look at the data, we can see clearly evidence that women do not get promoted more rapidly than men. The data simply doesn't show it. And most organizations' data will show that. The industry, you know, you see it in McKinsey reports or whoever else, that women are not being promoted faster into senior roles. It just simply isn't happening. The data doesn't show it. But an individual man, there may be some circumstance that has led him to believe that that's what's happened systemically around him, when it could just be an isolated case. So I do think approaching this with well, let's understand why your perspective is that perspective is you know, a good starting point. It could be that, you know, he just believes it's all a load of woke nonsense and we all need to move on. But unless you ask him that question, then it's like anyone else. Let's hear about your lived experience. That's
Gary.
Yeah.
Gary, sorry. Go ahead.
Go, David.
No, you go ahead, David.
I was just going to say it's similar to something we discussed earlier. There's I don't disagree with, you know, understanding what it's there. I mean, we can look at the data, or you could open your eyes and take a look around the office and you'll know the answer. But there's the other, and we can also talk about what is it. It might be a fear, and it's you've attributed that to the great threat that's out there to you. But there's the other side to it where you can actually we're missing ourselves the point, which is that gender diversity is not about helping women into positions. It's about everybody benefiting from gender diversity in the workplace. So you know, this, yeah, it's not about you. So, you know, you avoid of course nobody gets promoted ahead of you. You look at yourself first, but you're missing the point. You know, we're missing the point, missing the value, missing the fact that everybody benefits, you know, yeah, that's the kind of the frustration where you have to accept that everybody has an opinion and they have a lived experience and they have other pressures on them and other concerns. But fundamentally, you have to come back to the point where it really it's not about helping women. You know, it's about the benefits that you will, as a man, realize by working in a diverse environment. Their end of the lesson. I'll keep quiet now.
Oh, it's a great point.
Can I add to what David was saying? Because I would have said the same thing, but then add an and to it.
Absolutely.
And the and is typically organizations talk about merit. They refer to themselves as meritocracies. But that is not the case when there are artificial barriers put in place that, should I say, block the progression of females or other people that are disadvantaged in one form or the other. So what an organization is really doing by looking at the role of females, and it is removing artificial barriers so that there can be true meritocracies that benefit the whole organization. And if you're good in your job, really and truly, if you're the most capable person, you have nothing to worry about.
Really great point about meritocracies. I think there's a whole 1 hour we could spend on defining what people mean when they say, you know, we promote on merit and likewise. Conscious that Alex, Hannah, Matthew, you haven't had an opportunity to jump in. Is there anything you'd like to add? I don't want to press you if you don't feel comfortable, but is there anything you'd like to, on any of these questions, like to think about or add? Okay, All right, I'll stop harassing you now. So I do apologise, but I just want to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to contribute. So look at the time, we've got a few minutes. So let's just explore this final question that we came across a lot. And I think this was one that not sure men would openly say this, but we found a lot of men would assume this, which was the lack of women in senior leadership is down to the fact that they've made a choice with their careers to focus on family. So it's all about, well, they've not made it to the top because they spent so many years focusing on childcare and issues related to that. So what do people think is a good response when people say that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Hannah.
Sorry, I'm not going to put my camera on, but yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. And for me, I think it's about making the workplace a kind of a better environment for women, rather than saying, oh, you know, they've made the choice to spend more time with their family and that's why they haven't been able to progress. It's, you know, it's been a choice for them. Because I think a lot of women want to have an active part in their family life. They want to see their children, as a lot of men do, of course, but also they're ambitious and they want to progress. So yeah, for me, I think it's about trying to change the environment rather than saying that.
Really interesting point. And I think you're absolutely right. There's a ton of things that organizations can do to, let's say, level that playing field in some way. So yes, thank you. Great points. Anyone else on this particular subject of impact?
I've recently, I was actually talking to a colleague who said we're both just starting a new job, and he said he's taking paternity leave. So he's got a 3-month-old and he's taking paternity leave for 5 months from December, which I thought was really cool. He's basically sharing his parental leave with his wife. I was just thinking, how much is it? I guess not as big corporations in general or whatever, or colleagues, but actually us as men, when we do have children, in terms of making sure that our partners go back to work actually, and being like, how much do we as I'm not a father yet, but how much do we as fathers want to actually have that time with our children that we do have, to actually encourage our partners to go back to work. So I think that's also part of the fixation of being like, we should want that. And I think that will be a key driver of change. If we want to spend that time with, if I had a kid, I'll definitely want to spend as much time as my girlfriend would want to spend.
Get careful what you're saying there, Alvaro.
So in that sense, I want to really share that time. So I guess it's how much is it on us to drive that time, so that, I think it would really fixate women going back to the workplace.
I think there's a really interesting nugget in what you're saying. I mean, sorry, everything you said there was really interesting, Alvaro, but there's a really fascinating nugget, I think, here. And this topic of what can male allies do, and I personally am increasingly, uncomfortable with the phrase allies, because it does imply men helping women as opposed to men doing their fair share of the work, to David's point about building a gender balanced workplace. But I think there is something really interesting, and you're probably in more of a position for this, Alvaro, than most of the rest of the men on this call. That's making a sweeping generalization, so I do apologize. But there is something there about men demanding opportunities around parental leave from their organizations if they do not exist. So we know there are companies that make parental leave a completely equitable arrangement across all genders, irrespective of it doesn't even matter what your choice around, your child, whether that's natural birth, whether that's adoption, whether that's surrogacy, whatever it might be, but recognizing the importance and setting the bar equally and allowing, individuals to choose. And there's something there, isn't there, about if men were more demanding of this from their employer, I think there's an opportunity to generate further change. I think that's quite
used it as well when it's available, because the other problem is often it's available and then people don't use it, or they keep quiet about it and it's not that visible. So I think the more those examples are visible, that can also make a huge difference.
Isn't that a relatively modern thing though? Like over the last 5-10 years, hasn't that started to come in more so? So I think the next 5 to 10 years will be quite interesting to watch.
Yeah, I agree, Seb. I mean, you know, this is if I was running a large organization, this is something that you'd be thinking about in terms of competitive advantage, right? I mean,
I think it's something where women can be allies to men in a way as well, and really encourage it. But also we need to change that kind of how we might talk to new dads or people who are expecting is, you know, instead of assuming that they'll take their 2 weeks paternity leave and actually let's find that all a bit tricky. Well, no, let's really support them and question if they want, you know, are they going to take longer, and make that more of the expectation. So it's not an expectation that they'll only have a couple of weeks. It's the expectation, well, are you not going to have longer? Why not? Why don't you make the most of this time? And actually, if we can have our leaders sort of having that conversation and making it more normal, then men will have more courage to say, yes, I want to take it, and it hopefully it won't adversely impact my career. And then that will hopefully support women who do the same to see that they can come back into the workplace and pick up where they left off as well.
Great point, Bethan, and a perfect end note. So I'm conscious we're at time. It's funny actually. So the last one of these we ran, we used to run these inclusion interactions for 45 minutes, and we were finding we're running out of time. So based around feedback from everyone last time, we've now extended to an hour, and I can see that we're still running out of time. There was at least another 5 questions I could have posed. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so important that we continue to kind of hear from this community. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your great thoughts with us. Plan is to return in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to talk more about I think it's going to be a similar theme. So the next chapter of our book is some of the more specific things that we did to challenge some of those male mindsets. So I think we're going to shape it around, you know, so you've had that initial conversation, you've heard some of their challenges, their thoughts. So what do you do next? I think that will be our subject for discussion in a fortnight's time. We haven't quite published that onto the event plan yet, but we'll hopefully get that up and running in the next few days. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank
really
you, Stephen. Bye all.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.